The age of Napoleon had unleashed new forces throughout the entire world. We shall examine this week the rise of political ideologies and the growth of nationalism, as groups abandoned the idea of multinational empires for states that represented particular linguistic, cultural, and religious groups. Despite the growth of nationalism, though, conservatives would attempt their best to control and even suppress nationalistic aspirations. The man in the upper right-hand corner that you see there is a young Karl Marx, and his ideology, of course, will come to dominate the 19th and then the 20th centuries. Both the French and Industrial Revolutions had engendered numerous responses to them, both in favor of and against them. One of those responses was the growth of ideology. This term was coined by Antoine de Tracy, a French Enlightenment aristocrat and philosopher who conceived of the term in 1796 as the science of ideas. Ideology, or ideology, as some would like to call it that, is a coherent set of beliefs about the way the social or political order should be organized. It is not necessarily reliant on knowledge or facts, as we well know today. Ideologies grew in the 1820s and the 1830s. One of the first great ideologies to grow during the early 19th century was classical liberalism. Please do not confuse this with the liberalism that is considered to be a pejorative word for conservatives today. Classical liberalism had its adherents among the rapidly expanding middle class. Classical liberals wanted constitutional guarantees of personal liberty and free trade. Liberals favored the Industrial Revolution. They opposed the violence of the French Revolution. Perhaps the greatest apostle of liberalism was the British parliamentarian Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was a philosopher, he was a jurist, and he was a social reformer. He is regarded as the founder of modern utilitarianism. Bentham defined modern utilitarianism as the fundamental axiom of his philosophy and the principle that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. He called for parliamentary and penal reform, and he advocated individual and economic freedoms, the separation of church and state, freedom of expression, equal rights for women, the right to divorce, and, in an unpublished essay, the decriminalizing of homosexual acts. He was also an early advocate of animal rights. Peter would have loved Bentham. He condemned the slave trade. He condemned capital punishment. He condemned corporal punishment, especially for children. As such, he had considerable influence on the reform of prisons, schools, the poor laws, the courts itself, and Parliament even. In Bentham's day, liberals were members of the Whig Party. Bentham died on June the 6th, 1832, at aged 84, at his residence in Queen Square Palace in Westminster, London. He had continued to write up to a month before his death, and in total keeping with his worldview and his ideology, he had made careful preparations for the dissection of his body after death and then its preservation as an auto icon. Bentham's corpse is kept in a glass display case at University College London's Student Centre and wheeled in so that he does not miss a session of the University Council. Unfortunately, the mummification process that was employed at the time rendered his head distastefully macabre, and it became a very macabre custom for students from the college to steal his head. So a wax head was fashioned. However, you will find that his head is still there and it is down there between his 2 feet. Marxism, which many people incorrectly associate with socialism, and one of those reasons being the fact that Marx and his disciples used the term socialism to be interchangeable with communism and Marxism and so forth. But Karl Marx was born in Germany. He was essentially a stateless person, though, because his writings made him a revolutionary, a radical, and he could not live in Germany, obviously. So he lived in London most of his life, did most of his research in the reading room of the British Museum. His two great books are The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. The Communist Manifesto is a history of class struggle, in which Marx posited the theory that capitalists who possessed the most wealth would eventually engage in a struggle against the working class, that is, the proletariat. The proletariat would rise up to throw off the yoke of the bourgeoisie, that is, the middle class capitalist and the upper class capitalist, and remake society. Das Kapital is an examination of how capitalism transforms societies. And it is Marx whose theories are going to revolutionize the world in the 20th century, although he wrote in the 19th century. With Marx's writings and the writings of others, utopian socialists came about. Now, utopia was the ideal society. It had been first posited by Sir Thomas More, the Chancellor to King Henry VIII, who was executed during the English Reformation. But these socialists now create, in theory and in practice at times, utopias, in which you have cooperation rather than competition, in which society would be better off without private property. Robert Owen was a Scottish utopian. He moves to the United States. He created a utopian socialistic community in New Harmony, Indiana, down in southwest Indiana. He would later work with the radical Republican administration after the Civil War. The utopian socialist movements did not survive because they looked better on paper than they did in reality. But the utopian socialist movements did inspire union movements later in the 19th century. Now, what influenced Marxism? How did Marxism come to be? Well, its basis is in a German philosopher named Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was a German philosopher of the Enlightenment who developed idealism. Idealism is the notion that reality is indistinguishable from ideas. And so for Marx, the state became the ideal, and therefore the state became the ultimate reality. In addition, there was Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach. He is a German socialist, and a critique of Christianity that he makes as sort of what Marx will later call the opiate for the masses. Religion is the opiate for the masses. Feuerbach is considered the bridge from Hegel to Marx. Now again, I am not doing a political science class, but I strongly recommend that if you're more interested in this, please take one of the many political science or philosophy classes that deal with Marx. And there is a professor of history that sometimes works at UNO named Professor Jason Dawsey, who is a very committed Marxist. And I would certainly want you all to take a class with him if you're more interested in this. Understanding Marxism is crucial today, not because I personally am a Marxist or I advocate for Marxism. It is simply, if we're going to banter around things like socialism today and Marxism and so forth, it's best to understand that which is being talked about. Well, I already showed you the picture of Marx as a young man. This is Marx when he was older. And then at the end, this was Marx in his classical photograph stage that is adorned many a communist hall and government, still in places like North Korea and other communist nations. This is an artist's depiction of Robert Owen's New Harmony community in southwest Indiana. Nothing exists of it anymore. There's only a historical marker there now. Whereas Marxism is a political ideology, Industrialism is exactly what it sounds like, an industrial ideology. Developed by Claude Henri, the Comte de Saint-Simon, industrialists believe that work should be controlled by scientists, engineers, artists, and manufacturers, that is, the experts. They saw the chief threat as idlers in society who grew fat and lived off the work of others and did nothing in return. Kind of like the Kardashians, you know. He used the United States as a model. He developed the idea of a meritocracy. That is, you are not determined, your place in life is not determined by your birth, it's determined by your achievements, what you can do. Saint-Simonian women organized and created their own circular called the Free Woman. Now, developing upon this was Francois-Marie Charles Fourier. He said that with utopian socialism, there would be no violent struggle needed. See, Marx called for violent struggle. Fourier says there's no need for violent struggle. Utopian socialism is something that we should aspire to without any violence. He's an early advocate of feminism. He spoke of women as individuals, not as half the human couple. Fourier was also one of the earliest advocates for homosexuals. On the other hand, Fourier was a little bit out there in his writings. He wrote that under a perfect utopian society, the oceans would turn into lemonade, and the polar caps would become as warm as the Mediterranean, although the latter is becoming true for another set of reasons. In the arts and culture, the post-Napoleonic period was the age of the Romantics. Now, when we think of romance today, we think of love. We think of hearts and valentines and all that, candlelight dinners and dancing in the moonlight and walking on the beaches and all that kind of stuff. That's only a small part of Romanticism. Romanticism is the reaction against the rationalism and formality of the classical style and a rejection of the industrial age. In other words, they're saying that the Enlightenment has gone too far. The Enlightenment has sanitized society too much. What we need is a little embracing of the beauty for beauty's sake. And industrialism has also caused too much as far as a sanitary, unfeeling environment. Romanticism glorifies nature, emotion, genius, and imagination. We see romanticism in all aspects of the arts, in poetry, like George Gordon, better known as Lord Byron. His epic poem, Don Juan, is perhaps his most famous. In it, Don Juan is not actually the seducer, he is the seduced. Byron would later die of disease while fighting the Greek War of Independence at only the age of 36, and many people said that he committed suicide by war because he had fathered a child, with one of his family members. Then there is William Wordsworth, whose magnum opus is considered to be The Prelude. Wordsworth, along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, initiated the Romantic Age with their co-publication of poems titled Lyrical Ballads. And in Lyrical Ballads is Coleridge's best known poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, with its famous motif of the albatross and the line that everybody should know, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. His other famous poem is Kubla Khan. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-domed decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. In paint, you had an Englishman, a Frenchman, and a German leading the Romantic Age. Joseph Mallord William Turner, better known as William Turner, was an English artist. He was known for expressive colorizations, imaginative landscapes, and turbulent, often violent marine paintings. His landscape paintings are often called the best. Ferdinand Eugene Victor Delacroix was a French painter and leader of the French Romantic school. He emphasized color and movement over clarity and carefully modeled form. His inspiration was not the classical modern models of Greek and Roman art, but North Africa, where he traveled in search of exotic themes. He was a very close friend of Byron. Caspar David Friedrich was a German romantic artist. He is best known for his mid-lyrical allegorical landscapes, which typically feature contemplative figures silhouetted against night skies, morning mists, barren trees, or Gothic ruins. His primary interest was the contemplation of nature. And in music, there is the great one himself, Ludwig van Beethoven, who I'll get to in a little bit. What is the focus of Romanticism? Anxiety about the Industrial Revolution. What is the Industrial Revolution creating in this world? A new world, a savage world. And nowhere is that better reflected than in Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's great novel, Frankenstein, which some would say it's pronounced Frankenstein. She wrote the novel in 1880. It's subtitled The Modern Prometheus. We know the story very well. The monster itself is industrialization. And yet, the monster itself is romantic. He wants to feel. He wants to have life. You also have Sir Walter Scott, who wrote Ivanhoe, and the great poem about Scotland, Rob Roy. From the top left to the bottom right is George Gordon, Lord Byron. In the center, William Wordsworth. And in the lower right, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Time for a little art lecture. Here is Joseph M.W. Turner in the upper left. Here is his painting, The Fighting Temeraire, tugged to her last berth to be broken up. This was painted in 1838, oil on canvas. It hangs in the National Gallery in London. This is Modern Rome, Campo Vaccino in 1839. Notice the mists and the figures in the foreground. This is a typical painting of Turner. This is Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway, 1844. This is an oil on canvas. It's in the National Gallery in London. Again, notice the mistiness of it, the unclear lines in here. Now here is Eugene Delacroix in the upper left, and he was one of the few romantics that ever allowed himself to be photographed because photography was considered to be a product of the industrial age. Now this is his famous painting, Liberty Leading the People. This is not from the French Revolution of 1789, however. This is actually from the French Revolution of 1830. Remember that the French Revolution is considered by many in France to be an ongoing thing. And there were revolutions in 1830 in which they overthrew the last Bourbon king, Charles X, and then there's another revolution in 1848, another revolution in the 1870s, another revolution in the 1940s, and so on. Now here you see Delacroix's The Death of King Sardanapalus. He painted this in 1827 and now hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Sardanapalus was a king who had become so slothful that he did not even get up to defend his own household when they were invaded by an enemy army. Here is Delacroix's Christ on the Sea of Galilee, painted in 1854. It hangs in the Louvre. Also hanging in the Louvre is the bark of Dante, the bark meaning the boat, the barge, showing Dante going down into the further pits of the Inferno. Now here in the upper left is Caspar David Friedrich and his most famous painting, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. This is rocky landscape in the Elbe sandstone mountains, painted between 1822 and 1823. It hangs in the museum in Berlin. This is not one of his most famous paintings, but Friedrich painted Cemetery Entrance It hangs in the Galerie Neumeister, and that is located in the town of, yes, you guessed it, Dresden. Remember Dresden. Always keep Dresden in the back of your mind. This is the Sea of Ice, 1823-24. Many people associate this painting with Frankenstein because that, of course, is the climax of the book takes place on the ice in the polar areas. This hangs in the Kunsthalle in Hamburg. And there is Ludwig van Beethoven in his most famous Fifth Symphony in C minor. Beethoven was born in Bonn in a very dysfunctional home. He was pretty much brutalized by his father and teachers because of his talent. He went through 3 periods of musical composition, the early period, then the heroic period, and then the late periods in which he grew increasingly deaf. Despite his deafness, he continued to compose, even cutting the legs off the piano and putting his ear to the floor so he could feel the vibrations from when he struck the piano keys. On the left is Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, on the right, was poet and author of works like the play Prometheus Unbound and the poem Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked him and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Percy Bysshe Shelley was admired by figures like George Bernard Shaw, Karl Marx, and Gandhi. But he was controversial in his time for his atheism and several other views. He died in a boating accident in Italy at the age of 29. Here is an illustration from the book Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. What's interesting about the book is they don't really go into the details of how the monster was created. It's alluded to, there's some peripheral imagery, but not like you see in the Frankenstein movies today. There is, of course, Sir Walter Scott, who wrote Ivanhoe, and Rob Roy. Mark Twain later said that so many Southerners, especially ladies, loved to read his works, that son of a bitch is the reason why we had an American Civil War. The next great ism of the 19th century is nationalism. Nationalism is a very chameleon-like ideology because it can base itself in various other isms. It can be based in liberalism, conservatism, industrialism, communism. What is a nation? A nation is a community of people formed on the basis of a common language, history, ethnicity, a common culture, and in many cases, a shared territory. A nation is an imagined community in the sense that the material conditions exist for imagining extended and shared connections. and that it is objectively impersonal. Even if each individual in the nation experiences themselves as subjectively part of an embodied unity with others. For the most part, members of a nation remain strangers to each other and will likely never meet. And many people say that Saints fans are the Who Dat Nation, or Boston, you have Boston Nation, and so forth. Nations are not always restricted to political boundaries. Iraq is a perfect example of that. Nations can be very prone to violence. Nationalism was stirred among numerous peoples in Europe by Napoleon, who was the carrier of the revolutionary principles and of nationalism. As such, large, multilingual, and multicultural states like Austria and Russia were susceptible to nationalistic violence. As language is one of the most foundational aspects of a nation, here are the linguistic boundaries of Europe. These are the linguistic boundaries of Asia. And last but certainly not least, the linguistic boundaries of Africa. Nationalism, being the most prone to violence and having the potential to cause the most instability in a political state, definitely engendered a great deal of fear among the rulers of Europe. And the rulers of Europe were aristocrats. They misunderstood nationalism. And these misunderstandings led to oppression, which resulted in revolt. Austria is one of the most polynationalistic states, and you see the map of Austria there with its numerous flags of its nations there. Metternich responded to nationalism by closing down the presses, suppressing student societies, even restricted borders within the Austrian Empire. What this did was flame the nationalistic fires. Now, it was done with a purpose, other than to just suppress nationalism. Metternich is not like some guy that just doesn't like these people and wants to put them down. He's trying to control the situation. The same thing was happening in Russia. Tsar Alexander I withdrew guarantees to the Poles because he feared Polish nationalism a great deal. Even the United States had nationalistic tendencies. It was nationalism that in part fueled the War of 1812, because still, up to 1812, the United States and independent nations still had a great deal of connection with Britain. Some of this connection was antagonistic, of course, but many of the young men that started this war, the John C. Calhouns, the Daniel Websters, the Henry Clays, the Richard Mentor Johnsons, and so forth, these were young, ardent nationalists who wanted to have their nation start to really separate itself from Britain completely, not just politically. It was not just in Austria or the United States or Russia where it went on the march. In Poland, Adam Mickiewicz was a Polish poet, dramatist, essayist, publicist, translator, and a political activist. He's regarded as the national poet of Poland and Lithuania and Belarus. He portrayed Poland as a crucified country by the three imperial powers that had dissolved it, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. In fact, the Polish salute today is that of the fingers of Christ on the cross. In Italy, remember that Italy was not a unified political state at this time. It was divided up among the Kingdom of Savoy, the Papal States. The Spanish still had a great deal of influence, and the Austrians controlled most of northern Italy. Giuseppe Mazzini, who was born in Genoa, was an Italian politician, journalist, and activist. And together with Giuseppe Garibaldi, who we will look at a little bit later on, founded La Giovine Italia, that is the Young Italy movement. And this was to create an Italian nation. And by 1860 and 1870, they would complete this transformation. German nationalism was romantic in nature. It was developed by Johann Gottfried Herder and was based on the principles of collective self-determination, territorial unification, and cultural identity, as well as a political and cultural program to achieve those ends. Now, nationalism had been sparked again by Napoleon, and it generated a renewed interest in language and folklore, such as displayed by two brothers, Jacob Carl Ludwig Grimm and his younger brother by 1 year, Wilhelm Carl Grimm. Yes, they are the brothers Grimm, who compiled all the old German folk tales like Cinderella, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and Hansel and Gretel, among others. But they sanitized the tales to make them more readable as children's stories. For instance, in the original tale, Cinderella's sisters actually broke the bones of their feet in order to fit into the glass slipper. The hunter was supposed to bring back the heart and liver of the girl Snow White to the queen. Middle-class Germans wanted a German state, but the Congress of Vienna opposed it and created instead a very weak German confederation. But the Germans started their unification not through political unification, but through economic unification. They created what was called the Zollverein, that is, the breakdown of trade barriers to bring the German states close together. Once again, you see economics coming to the forefront in bringing Europe closer together. This is, again, one of the foundations of the European Union, the Zollverein. Now, the Slavic people, their nationalism began very much as did German nationalism. It was a result of Napoleon, of course. Now, Russian nationalism upheld rural customs over industrialization. They found that industrialization was a bad thing. As a matter of fact, Russian peasants, in opposition to industrialization, at times would throw their shoes into the machinery in order to break it. These Russian shoes were called, in the Slavic language, sabot, hence the term sabotage. Southern Slavs, better known as Yugoslavs, were very much interested in obtaining independence from Austria, and this was again very much feared by Metternich. This is the Millennium of Russia monument that was built in 1862 that celebrated the millennia of Russia, 1,000 years of Russian history. Nationalism can take many forms. Nationalism in this country, the United States, remember the 4th of July, that's nationalism through and through. We mark it with nationalistic celebrations, fireworks, barbecues, mattress sales. Obviously, we've been very focused on Europe through all this, and we will continue to be to a certain degree. Guiding the European ship, so to speak, was Prince Clemens von Metternich, who I've mentioned several times in this lesson, who was one of the three great negotiators at Vienna. Clemens von Metternich was not a reactionary. He was a pragmatist. He tried to set up the European powers at the Congress of Vienna to keep down revolution. But he also advocated reform. He wanted to give the nationalists something, but not everything. He understood better than most that multinational empires could effectively control the darker aspects of nationalism. And the previous presidency in this country shows the darker aspects of nationalism, America first and so forth. In 19th century Europe, there was darker aspects of nationalism that would later come to the forefront in the 20th century. Austria, Prussia, and Russia refused to enact the reforms that Metternich said needed to be enacted. And this will eventually lead us to the First World War. It'll first lead us to the revolutions of 1848, and then 60 years later with the First World War. Metternich managed to keep a general peace throughout Europe and throughout the world from the time of Napoleon until 1848. When the revolutions of 1848 broke out, Metternich then said, "I've had enough." He stepped aside. But until that point, he was known as the coachman of Europe.